All right. Welcome, everyone. Hi, Mona. Hey, Ivana.
Hey everyone.
All right. Welcome to our seventh coffee talk. So excited to have you guys today. Um, Today, we're talking about mental health and structural stigma, how these things and mental health, as well as taking a quick detour to come clean about some stuff that we haven't necessarily highlighted in our campaign and felt it was really important to prioritize. But first, I'd like to introduce a new face to the show. Ivana, welcome all the way in Chicago. That's awesome. You're doing some awesome work with your communities there in the education sector, working with the gift program and Noble, it sounds like, to get those resources that are really important for students in that area. Could you tell us a little bit more about what you do?
Yeah, of course. So I am a philanthropic partnership associate at a charter school network back in Chicago. It's actually one of the biggest networks over there. And what we do is that I meet with major donors to keep them in the loop about what the schools are doing and what our students are doing. And we also connect with individual campuses and fulfilling the needs for each student. So each school is based in different all around Chicago. And so what we do is that we serve 98% of students are students of color, and 81% of them are first generation students, and 80, I want to say 80, 95 around there are students who are eligible for lunch, for reduced or free lunch. And so we serve these students, and I actually attended one of those high schools. So it's nice to be able to give back and being able to provide. And sometimes it's as simple as, providing that test for an AP score. Because as we all know, those tests cost like $120. And so we're able to fulfill those needs so that our students can take those tests.
Awesome. That's so honorable. Mona, I would love to throw it to you to kind of talk about the direction that we're taking today, and talk about these issues that we've got going on.
Yeah, thanks Al, thanks Ivana. So we're going to be real with you all for a second. As we've been talking about stigma and all the ways it can show up in our lives, such as internalized, social, and structural, we've been also talking about how it doesn't discriminate against any identity. That being said, we've realized that we haven't been as intentional about how it can affect different marginalized groups. For example, communities of color and the queer community. We've touched on how stigma in all of its forms disproportionately impacts communities of color and other marginalized communities, but we've unfortunately wrongly assumed that we can just brush that onto each discussion as opposed to putting it at the forefront of some of these conversations. Um, and I'm going to mention the word marginalized a lot. I know that that might be an unfamiliar term to some folks. So, what it means is to dismiss a group of people or someone to an unimportant or powerless position within a society or group. For example, communities of color, queer community, if you have a disability, um, things of that nature, those certain identities are kind of pushed to the wayside and seen as unimportant. Um, so we want to come clean and own our mistake of not being intentional about the very real and impactful way stigma can affect these marginalized communities. If we aren't intentional about the ways that systemic oppression, systemic racism, systemic homophobia can inflict harm on folks, in addition to the harm that structural stigma can bring, we aren't having the whole conversation that we need to be having. And therefore, we can't progress in a way that is fair and impartial for all. So with that, going forward, the focus is still going to be on stigma. We're talking about stigma after all with this Let's Talk About Stigma campaign. Um, but we need to be real about the different layers that can work in conjunction with stigma that can end up inflicting more harmful or different types of harm onto marginalized communities. like communities of color and the queer community. We're all victim to a culture that kind of forgets to be intentional about these issues, but allowing ourselves to learn how to not fall into that culture with compassion is needed in order to get this work done. This conversation around marginalized identities and race can be really hard. It is hard, even with some of us that do hold those identities. And it can be uncomfortable, it can be confusing, but just like we emphasize that talking about stigma can be uncomfortable and confusing, but it's needed to grow, the same thing applies to this. We're going to make mistakes along the way. We have on this campaign, but that's where accountability and growth comes in. Education, compassion, and empathy can help us work through these difficult conversations and therefore help us through and overcome violent and oppressive forms of stigma in all its forms. And so as we try to be more inclusive and real in the coming weeks, we're going to make sure we follow up with resources that can better help us wrap our minds around these complex and sometimes unfamiliar issues. And today we'll be following up with some helpful terminology. So keep an eye out for that. And if anything comes up that maybe not makes sense or is unfamiliar, please feel free to reach out. There's a personal message option on our Facebook page, and we can definitely clarify or provide more resources around anything that folks need more clarity on. This is a learning space. We're not here to judge anyone. We're working through it together. So thanks everyone for listening to that. We hope we can move forward in a better way, and we hope that you all can join us in growing, learning, and working to overcome stigma in a way that's equitable and inclusive for all. So with that, I'll pass it over to you so we can get to know Ivana a little more.
So well said, Mona. Thank you so much. I'm so glad that we kind of came to our senses, you know. All right. So Ivana, oh my gosh, it's so good to have you here. You've been listening to our show and got involved, and it's so great to work with you. This week, we're focusing on structural stigma, following our mental health theme for this month. And I'm curious, what are some examples of mental health stigma that you experience in your work, in the education, as well as maybe through your own lived experience, if you're comfortable talking about it?
Yeah, I'll share a bit about my background. So I am Mexican, and so I come from a Latinx community, or Latino community. And one of the things within our culture, it's not normal to talk about therapy or taking medication. Other hand, it's like one of the misconceptions we often hear within our communities, and it might be similar to your communities, Mona or all. Is depression pills may make you worse, or things like that, other than helping you. And so I've personally never taken any depression pills, but one of the things that I've recognized within my own, I travel a lot, and I used to travel a lot for my job, and I would constantly get, I guess, a sense of like sadness, but I didn't recognize what it was, and it would last 3 to 4 months. Turns out that I would get seasonal depression, just because the environment around me was changing. And that started to show when I came to Ohio. I actually went to Denison University, and the first 3 to 4 months, I remember just having a really hard time adapting to college. I was also a first generation student, and so my parents didn't really understand what kind of support they could provide at that moment. And so they just saw it as like, oh, like you just missed home. They didn't really see anything beyond that. And I didn't see it anything beyond that, other than I don't think I was in the right space at that moment. But when I started looking for like resources and mentors, they started guiding me through the process, but I never really had a therapist then. And then I moved back home from Denison when I graduated from college. And it hit me again, just coming and changing to a different culture, coming from a very strict machista culture. Machista in terms that, within, that's a word that we use in Spanish. And it's a culture that's man dominated in what a woman and a man can do. And so we, within my culture, and it's very similar to other cultures, oftentimes the women are seen as caretakers and they cook and everything. But including to that, it's not very common for us to, let's say, leave our home until we're probably married, or we have to do all of these things. And even then, like, my parents have a hard time seeing me out of like their house. And so when I came back, I remember just really struggling and adapting back to the rules, and really understanding everything. When I've had freedom in college, I studied women and gender studies, and it was something very different and liberating for me. And so I realized that no, like, this is not. I don't. There were certain parts of my culture that I didn't really align with or agree with. And I think oftentimes we sense to normalize our feelings, because we think it's normal, or, those feelings of sadness. And so I would have it, and it would hit me again 3 to 4 months, until I got a job. And turns out I had to travel to Texas in October. I graduated in May and then traveled to Texas in October. And so then it was again another 3, 4 months. And I was like, what's going on? Like, this is not, like, this is not okay. I'm not adapting well. Like, I'm going to different environments and different communities. And so my therapist turned out to tell me, like, this is seasonal depression. Like, it hits you 3 to 4 months, or however long it can take longer. And so what are things that I am doing that, that I can overcome? So oftentimes for me, it was just like focusing on, like, am I cooking? Am I exercising? Am I reading? If I'm not doing any of these things, then obviously I'm not feeling myself. And I mean, recently I moved again. When was it, 2 weeks ago? And this is the first time that I haven't had that sense of feeling sadness. And I have my family like 20 minutes away, and it might be because I have them near, but at the same time, I have my own freedom of, like, not living in a very cultural state family, and so those are things that I think within communities, many of my friends, for example, cannot go out in their age, in their 26, and so they have curfews, and so those are things that affects us as women, what kind of liberties we're given within our culture, and we often don't recognize how mentally it can affect us when we are being controlled or policed, and have not only experienced it there, but I experienced it when I went to high school. There was instances where if I asked to go to the restroom, I actually had an escort. And so the escort was a security guard, and he would wait outside the lockers until I got out of the bathroom. I had less than 5 minutes to go to the bathroom, and if we asked for an escort to go to the bathroom, we would get a demerit. If we got 4 demerits in 2 weeks, we would get a detention, and that was 3 hours long. And so, oftentimes, like, if you're on your period, like, those are things that you cannot control as a woman. Then you have to go to the bathroom. You probably have to change every 2 to 3 hours. And so those were things that I think we didn't feel like we were respected as women, and they were not understanding even our own body and our needs as a whole. And those things start to add up over time. And even now, when I see my therapist, it's things that my parents still don't understand of why I see a therapist. And they see it as like, oh, like, you're probably crazy, but then they see me and they're like, you're not crazy, but like, why are you seeing a therapist? Like, it's very hard for them to even understand of, like, what therapy means. And I don't know. So that's a little bit of my background. I probably gave too much.
No, thank you for that.
Ivana, that a lot of that resonated with me. That's super real, and I think I'm a child of immigrants too, and I think first and second generation like children or folks that grow up here often kind of grow up with blurred boundaries, their home life being different than their school or outside social life, and that can make for a world of mental health problems, just not knowing, just having a jarring, I think, distinction between the two, or like figuring out what's right and what's wrong, where do you belong, who are you, right, in these two different worlds almost. And I know that that's what I hear in your story. I hear that with a lot of other first and second generation um, uh, children and folks as well. And then there is a lot of added layers to the women and femme presenting children of immigrants as well. So really, really appreciate you sharing that perspective. It's an important one.
Absolutely. Ivana, in your work with the schools, do you see kind of the same things impacting people in high school today? Is it something that, like mental health stigma in particular, in the structure of education? How does that look? What are you seeing in your work with these big entities? Right? I'm just curious.
Yeah, so I attended public, private, and charter schools. When I went to elementary and high school, and when I first attended the public school was from kindergarten to sixth grade, and oftentimes within that school, I would see the lack of resources. We were very underfunded. We would get old books all the time, and students were obviously behind. And I mean, I even remembered I was way behind of the class, and I would just sit there and like draw all over my notebook, and I would just wait. And so even for the students who were behind, they were not getting that one-on-one attention. We had classes over 30 students, and with one teacher, it was really just impossible. Until my parents made the sacrifice to like change me to a private school. But it was very hard on them, seventh and eighth grade. I remember my dad just working two jobs, and the second job was like at Pizza Hut, and all we ever ate was pizza from Pizza Hut, just because they had to pay my tuition, which was like $550 a month. Because I was undocumented, I didn't get any what is it, any scholarships. So I wasn't eligible for any of that. And so that was seventh and eighth grade. And I noticed a difference in terms that, yes, it was very similar to public school. We did get like the freedom, but we also got the care and attention. And that meant one-on-one attention. I felt like I mattered compared to in a public school. I felt like, none of us really matter or got the attention we needed to actually succeed in school. Like I remember sixth grade seeing a girl like grab scissors and cut herself, and I saw that many times. And those were things that were not stopped. And I never understood of like, why are these girls just cutting themselves and they're not getting the attention that they need? Why, like, is there a social worker here? There was no social workers, there was no therapist. And so these girls were just sent home and they would come back the next day with just a band-aid, like, and those were things that you would see and you're like, what's really going on around here? And seventh and eighth grade, it was just very different for me. Obviously, there was no escort. Like we were given different liberties, even being in a Catholic school, that I felt like I was trusted by a teacher, but yet they were providing the educational that we needed. And if a student was behind, they would pull him out for 2 to 3 weeks, teach him math, and then he would be right where the class was. And that was like, wow, like that's crazy. How is he was behind he was already behind for a month. They pull him out, now he's ahead. And so those were things that I'm like, this is working. Then I went to a charter school, and that's where I work now. We work with 18 campuses. Back then, there was like probably 10 campuses. And rules meant, I was wearing a polo and khakis and a belt and like dress shoes all the time. The socks had to be either black or white. I got a demerit, 4 demerits if I forgot my belt. And oftentimes we would be pulled out of classroom to wait for our parents to ring that bell, and that meant missing on my education. Even for socks, it was the same thing. You have to wait for a parent to come to pick you up or bring you those pair of socks. I mean, even there was times where I just didn't even come to school because I was already running late, and I was like, I'm gonna get another demerit for this. That means I'm getting a detention. I'm just gonna stay home and like do all my homework ahead of time and turn that in as I never missed. And so those were things that I would do. But at the end, I was still missing on education. There was things that they were policing us. And I began to compare. I'm like, in private school, I was given everything, and I was given freedom. In this charter school, I'm given everything I need to learn education wise. Like, they gave us everything we needed, new books. They paid for our college applications. As many college, if you wanted to apply to 20 colleges, they paid for them. They didn't care. And so, they paid for your ACT, SAT. Like, they started, like, since the first day you stepped into that school, they told us, you're going to college and we're going to start testing you. You're going to start practicing your freshman year. And so they gave us everything you needed, I guess, to like really just go into college. Their acceptance rate is like, I want to say 99% of college acceptances. So it's really high, but a lot of that meant them being really strict on everything we ever did. Like, you couldn't talk. If we, like, one student cursed, we would be in silent, like we would be in level 0. So we couldn't talk the whole day. And so oftentimes I thought about, where's our personality? They're treating us as prisoners. We can't do nothing. We're not trusted. We're not even trusted to go out to the bathroom by this point. And when I compared private school, I was like, I was given all these liberties, and we were all doing very good. Even the students who were behind, they were doing good at the end of the day too. Everything was there. So now I want to say I graduated in 2014, so it's been 7 years. I started working this past August, and the past 2 years, there was a change of CEO, and it's a Black woman. And one of the first things that she did was, I remember her dyeing her hair purple, and she like left that rule. She's like, you guys can dye your hair. You all can dye your hair whatever color you want. And you might see it as very minimal, but for our students, it meant a lot. Why? Because we have never been allowed to do certain things like that. You would get in trouble. I remember one of my friends in high school had, like, did you ever see those feathers that you would put as a trend? And she came in after summer break, and she had her feather. Literally, one teacher came in and she like cut it off, like right there with her hair. Didn't say anything. She just came across, and we looked at her, and she was like, "What the hell just happened?" Like, she didn't even ask for permission, nothing. And so those are anatomies that you're taking away from a child. You're not letting that child be, I guess, build that personality of their own, and who they are, and not even giving them that trust. And so now that we are in a different way, we've committed into being more of an anti-racist organization. And so that means looking into all those policies that we're enforcing on our students. And even for me, that means, where are we allocating that money? What are we telling our donors? And we're also reminding our donors, like, this is what we're doing now. Are you on board? Because at the end of the day, it's the best for our students. And we have donors who are learning a lot about really what our students' backgrounds are. And, some of our students, I think one of you talked about it, some of our students are Black, and they're female, and they're queer. And there's just so many experiences that individual student brings to the school. And so, oftentimes they're not given that opportunity to share. And so we are really different. I think we've made progress. There's more work, but I think for the first time, we're telling students, like, you actually matter, and we're providing social workers. We're providing the therapists that they need. And if a student has a problem, then we're there, but compared to before, I think me being in a machista culture, part of my family, and then going to the school and just being policed was something that really just hit me, and saying, like, okay, so where do I belong, and what kind of spaces do I really want to be? And so now I feel like I live by myself, but I feel like I have more autonomy over my own self. And if there's rules I don't want to enforce on myself, then I don't have to. But I think that's very hard to really come across when you have never been given those liberties.
Yeah, that's so relatable on my end, just because I found public school very difficult um, for similar reasons, and I changed schools in high school as well, to a charter school that was more focused on self-expression. It was an art school, um, and it's so important to an individual, especially one that's growing at such a rate that you do at that age, um, to be able to express yourself, to feel like you matter, to feel like you're in a safe space to express yourself, but then also get the resources that you need. Because I mean, school's 8 hours a day. You're working pretty much, and it's so good to hear from you that you're seeing this in a part of the evolution of this institution that everyone is legally obliged to go to if you live in America. um, and I think that there's so many structures in our society that it's hard for it's we're not going to be able to talk about every structure today. It sounds like we're focusing on structures of racism and structures of the education system, because it's really nice to just isolate and dig deep into these things and how they impact people. Because um, the stories that you were telling about going to school and experiencing self-harm, like, that was trauma for that individual, but it was traumatic for you and folks in your class that experienced that as well. And that's something that we don't really talk about either, is how, like, these experiences, these moments can permeate through our lives. And the stigma that's experienced by us and in these institutions is something that needs to be addressed through resources, through education. Like, we need to talk about what wellness is, what mental illness is, how to identify it, how to take care of yourself and prioritize your own well-being. And that's just not the way the system is set up. It's set up to create successful students. A lot of public schools fail because they leave students behind, even though, I mean, you have that act. It's like leave no one behind, leave no child behind. But it's like, really, if you're not creating an accommodating and um, open environment for people to express themselves, to explore their personal interests, and you're just kind of like pumping them through this idea factory that is what a school is, then you're kind of holding people back and potentially causing harm in the long run. um, Mona, what do you think?
I agree with all of that. I think education is a huge place to start, or important place to start when it comes to talking about these institutionalized forms of stigma and oppression as well. And um, youth is just, I don't think we emphasize enough how important it is. Whatever we teach our youth just manifests into a lot of these different problems as well, and not even just what we teach them, but the culture that we cultivate. As you were speaking to, Ivana, like that policing culture in schools doesn't stop there. It manifests into a lot of different problems in the long run, and just perpetuates. It's just a microcosm of what we see happening in society at large, and it, as Al said, just permeates almost every aspect of our lives, in education, in the justice system, in work, right, in social life, and everything like that. So um, it's really good to hear that someone like you is in those spaces, but at the same time, it's not this like heroic, right, like act of yours or anything. It affects you, it affects the students you're in, and it's important to talk about all the different ways, and in everyone that those that kind of stigma and structural racism and oppression affects everyone in those institutions as well. So yeah, want to underscore everything that's been said around that. It's super super important.
So I'd like to open up another topic that's completely related, but how do we see, Ivana, especially, how do you see internalized stigma, public stigma, structural stigma, being related and how do they affect each other is it's something we've definitely touched on, but just kind of want to dig into that a little bit.
Yeah, I think, I'll provide you a prime example. I remember when I was 9 years old, I was walking with my friends, and so where I live, like even with my mom, we would always take the shortcut of the alley. And so, we were with my friends, we would take all the shortcuts that we could find, being in the alley. And the oldest person taking care of us at that moment was 15. And oftentimes, people would be critical of like, why would a 15-year-old look over like a bunch of kids? But oftentimes you find that you're going to the park, you're looking for your friends or whatever. And so we're walking through the alley, and we heard a shooting, and it was like literally like I want to say 3 feet, 4 feet away from us. And we saw the person, and we got scared. And I remember one of my friends she stood there and she was just standing there. She didn't move. The rest of us like literally hid behind the garbage cans. And I remember just pulling her, and we hit there. We didn't know what to do at that moment. We stood there and we waited for 10 minutes until the shooting stopped and whatnot. And then we left, and we ran towards the friend's house. Actually, two of the girls had ran and left us behind. And so I was stuck with the 12-year-old. And at that moment, we just, we were at the garbage cans and we were waiting. And then after that, we went and ran to that friend's house, and we all looked at each other, and we just didn't know what to do at that moment. We didn't know who to talk to or like what adult to trust to help us understand what was really going on, and it took us a week to even tell our parents. I was super scared to tell my mom because I was like, how do I tell my mom? I was in this scenario when she would have probably been pissed of like, why are you even outside? Like, how is that? What are you doing? And so for the longest, so then I wait, 2 weeks later, we find out who that person was. And it was a friend of that 15-year-old, her ex-boyfriend, and he just tried scaring us. He saw it as a prank. And so, I see your face, Alan, you're like, what? And at that moment, I was pissed. I remember just being so pissed about everything. And I was like, and I blamed him. And it took me, I want to say, until my second year of college that I finally came into terms with it, of like what really happened. And that was through a paper that I wrote at Denison. And it was really connected with, the education sector in the public school that we all attended. We were not, like I said, and I think you brought it up, that students who were conflicting with self-harm or who had anything going on, they were not given that attention. Students were obviously left behind. If there was any criminal or like if there were any gangs, it was very obvious. We all knew who were in gangs, but those students were not even given the attention. And so, those were things that were going on there. And then in the public, oftentimes, even going to college, I noticed that often things that we got criminalized for or like the police would come for in college, it was not something that I would see someone getting in trouble for. And so that was, I think, what would come within the public, sector of like what it looks for structure or stigma. And then I think internalized within us is like, as kids, when all these things are going on, like we see it as normal, and we don't know what to do. Mostly when we haven't received that mental health help. I have one of my colleagues, she's been in therapy for the longest, since she was 10 years old, and she is a white woman. And I think often about my community who I don't hear them going into therapy for so long unless they know someone, or they have like higher education or whatever that looks like. But it's not something I hear very often. And I often think about all these kids or that 15-year-old who thought it was a prank, but in reality, what were the needs that he needed to face whatever he was facing? What was really going on at his home? We were all living in poverty. And so like, there was just a bunch of things that I think about often of like, what was he going through? And I blamed him for so long. But in reality, I knew it wasn't really him. It was beyond of what could have been our control.
That's really powerful. Thank you for sharing all of that.
Yeah, thank you for sharing all of that and being really vulnerable around that. I think there's countless examples of how the three not only are related but exacerbate each other, right? And I think one common goal with the three is to marginalize and other folks in a way that it is harmful and allows those who are being othered to internalize that they are the problem, right? Or they're not deserving of a structure in place that would help them deal with whatever the problems they're going through, or even prevent it in a way, right? If they had those resources from jump, they would be supported in a way that doesn't bring them down a path of whatever. And so it's all intentional, right? And I think on the structural level, that's very apparent. And then when that structure of oppression and othering and marginalizing is there, a public narrative forms from that, right? Like that's how it should be, or these folks are on the outside and othered, right? That's normal. We normalize it from a young age, and that's where that public stigma is then internalized in a way, right? Like I'm thinking of stereotypes around certain ethnicities and cultures, and like genuinely believing them as a kid, right? Or genuinely believing that because the public thinks we are X or we are this because of the structures in place, then it must be true, right? That's a reality. There's no changing it. And that intentionality of oppression is what is, I think, the root of all of that in a lot of ways, convincing ourselves that we are also othered and deserve to be othered in a lot of ways if you are in a marginalized identity or group as well. So that's why these conversations need to happen, but silencing those conversations are also intentional too. Like these conversations shouldn't be happening according to the system, right? We are siloed off in many different ways, so we can't kind of come together to realize who the root of these problems and who the real enemy is, right? Like from that story, Ivana, I can see so many people immediately jumping and saying, well, whoever was shooting is like they're a bad person, or that's all there is to the story, right? And these conversations kind of allow us to dig deeper, find the root cause, but when they are intentionally suppressed and silenced, we can't talk about that and get to real solutions as well. So yeah, again, thank you for sharing that story. It's super important and allows us to kind of peel back the layers of a lot of these problems and issues we're talking about.
Something I'd really like to say, just because we are talking about education and marginalization in the context of structural stigma and mental health, is that in the education system, it's very common for folks with mental illness or folks that are neurodivergent with autism, ADHD, ADD to be like in their own way marginalized from the education, whether they're isolated to special programs or put in like if and in another way also like these special programs exist that kind of like exclude them from the rest of the student body, which I experienced not personally but like in my friends. And I did experience personal marginalization in that like my needs weren't necessarily met, and so I had to meet my own needs in whatever way that I could, which meant missing a lot of class and missing out on an education just because where I was at that time with my mental health was not conducive. Like I couldn't be in the environment that the education was happening in. And that was one way that I was like put off from that and why I needed to find another solution, because there wasn't that kind of like safe space in a way. And it's like there's spaces, there's conversations, there's different things that we should be incorporating in the education evolution that we're experiencing, that and Yvonne is a part of. And I just wanted to throw that in there as a personal story as well, because it's so important that we make education accessible to everyone, as well as make everyone feel like they are worthy, and eliminate that unimportant and powerlessness that comes with being marginalized.
Yeah, no, and I definitely agree. I often think about my brother. Um, he goes to a private school, but he also receives the support at home. He is really able to talk about his feelings. I mean, in pre-K, he had a really bad teacher in which she hated when he cried, if he missed his mom or whatever, and she would often shut him down. And we didn't find out until second grade, just because he received the love from a teacher and his trauma started to come into him in second grade. And oftentimes we find out that once we're in a safe space, those traumas come back to us. And they haunt us and we don't know what's going on with our bodies. But it's our bodies realizing you're in a safe space and this is where you can finally cry. This is where you can finally express. And we didn't know that, his pre-K teacher was like throwing his backpack. She was not giving him that support. Rather, she would explain to us that he needed special education classes, and turns out that he didn't even need that. And so it was a way to exclude him overall. And one of the things that even now we work on with him is feeling confident in himself, feeling confident in his answers. He often would say, this is the answer, and then I would just question it. I'm like, I don't, and I was like, is it? He's like, oh, I'm wrong, and I'm like, no, you're not. Like, you need to learn. Like, it was that confidence that his teacher just made sure that he didn't have. And I talk to him now, and he's confident in giving an answer. But it's because he's receiving those safe spaces at school, but at home. And if he cries, then it's fine. And that comes from a Latinx culture, a machista culture, in which I guess my dad will not be that happy, but he cannot say anything because it is his son. And oftentimes we have to be realistic and say our feelings matter. And even if you're a boy, you can cry. Even if you're a boy, you can do as you like, and you don't have to be in gangs, like the way I saw back in the neighborhood that I lived in. And so it's those safe spaces that we often provide, even within the education sector that I'm working with right now. One of the things that one of the schools is in Inglewood, and so in Chicago. And if people research it, they always see like, oh, it's like the highest crime rate, like it's very dangerous. Maybe both of you have heard of Inglewood probably, because it sometimes appears on Facebook and whatnot. And that campus specifically, it was built in a way that, even the principal, when I talked to him, he says the lights are very dim. Their cafeteria is their gym. I went to one of the campuses in downtown, meaning that we actually had a very fancy campus, because every time a donor entered, that's the building they saw downtown. Like you have nice furniture, every chair is worth $500. And then he talked about, how about his campus, and about how like even the walls look very gloomy, everything looks very gloomy. And we put it in Inglewood, where it's considered one of the highest in crime, highest place in crime, but also a lot of low income households. And so are we, like he said to me, like, are we saying that that's what our students deserve? Is this the space that they deserve? So at the end of the day is oftentimes we say, people who are from low income households don't deserve nice things, or we're very critical of those things. And so we say, why don't we provide those resources instead? And it could be as simple as a social worker. But in reality, those two things come into place, providing that safe space and also providing that social worker, to making sure that our students are doing well. And so right now we're actually even, that whole campus is gonna be renovated. and like the structure and everything, and that's something that we're looking into invest. And so that, and we're raising funds because the students deserve a safe space. They deserve a welcoming space, and we shouldn't base it on each neighborhood. They deserve to have, white, blue lighting, and that they deserve to have a space where they can come every day and socialize because, like you said, they spend 8 hours at school, and they need that space. It's not, they're only not only spending it at home, but they're also spending it in school. That's half of their life. And so, it's super important to also recognize those things when it comes to mental health.
Amazing, amazing. I'm so glad to hear that about your like investment into that. That's awesome. And you're right, because it's like the environments that we spend time in are formative years, right? And having that support in that system. I had a counselor in high school after I transferred who changed my life. I would sit in her office for like once a week or twice a week. I would just bother her. I was like, Karen, how are you today? Let's go. Let's talk about this stuff. And we talked about really big things and a lot about like this stuff here, because it's it's so crucial that we invest in young people and invest in their well-beings. And that's just one element, that's just one sector of the structural stigma equation, right? Like we haven't gotten into the medical field, we haven't gotten into like economic accessibility to resources outside of like young people. There's grown individuals out there that need, like, that could benefit from this care but don't have access to it because it's financially unacceptable. There's no insurance or their insurance doesn't support it. Find that a lot, which is unfortunate, but also with other structural forms like politically, how do we talk about mental health? Is it a part of the conversation? No, not really. Like during this pandemic, you've seen deaths of despair, which is suicides, overdoses, all of this stuff increasing like exponentially, and no one's talking about it. It's it's really scary because these things aren't going to get better unless we have these conversations, unless we take action to overcome and come together to solve these issues, and also like holding the people in power accountable for for being in power basically, and creating this environment when we are like the majority of people like don't have their voices heard and don't have the impact that we should have in shaping a society and shaping a country that serves us, right?
Absolutely.
All right.
Well, I think this has been amazing. Thank you, Al, Ivana, for such a wonderful conversation. As always, these coffee talks are my favorite part of my week for sure. We need to wrap up here. I wish we could talk about this. We could talk about this for hours. But again, we will link resources to this as we move forward with a more um, with intentionality around these issues and the different layers that can affect different marginalized identities. And we will be following up this week with helpful resources and other articles. And then we'll be hearing from more community members as well later this week and the oncoming weeks. Friendly reminder that we have a Justice Digital Recovery Cafe, March 5th, I believe, 7 o'clock, Al? Is that right?
7 o'clock followed by an open mic at 8:30.
All right. It's fun. In COVID times, don't really have a lot of opportunity to be social. So this is a wonderful opportunity to do that. It's a good, safe space where we can appreciate art and talk about the issues that may affect our communities as well. It's a great way to spend a Friday night. So thank you again, Ivana and Al. Hope to catch you all on the next one.
Thank you.
Thank you guys.
Bye.